Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha Tatarnic welcomes Mike Cosper to the show. Mike Cosper has been creating music, radio shows, and podcasts for more than 20 years. He produced and hosted the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast and is director of podcasts at Christianity Today. He now co-hosts a weekly podcast called The Bulletin. Cosper also leads cohorts for church leaders and is the author of 4 books, including Recapturing the Wonder and The Church in Dark Times. He and his family live in Louisville, Kentucky. A reminder before we start today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. You can connect with Martha, Lauren, and Future Christian on Instagram and all the social media platforms. Also, find us at future-christian.com, where you can send us a message with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice and how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Welcome to Future Christian. I'm your host today, Martha Tatarnic, and it is a privilege to welcome Mike Cosper to the show. Because I've spent so much time listening to your podcasts, Mike, I feel like I've been in conversation with you for a long time before now, but this is actually my first opportunity to speak with you, and I'm really excited to get to do so. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's just frame our conversation today with a couple of opening questions. We ask all of our guests a little bit of background before we get into the details of the work that we're exploring today. But can you just share a little bit with our listeners, Mike, something about your faith journey, what it has looked like in the past, and what it looks like now?
Yeah, so grew up in the church, grew up with Christian parents, more or less the kind of life that, you know, you look back and you say, I don't know a time when I wasn't a believer, which, you know, as a Southern Baptist, where crises of conversion are kind of part and parcel of the Christian life. That's a funny story, but that's definitely who I was. When I was 19, I joined the team of a church plant in Louisville, Kentucky, where I still live today. And then about a year after that, that would have been in 2001, I came on staff. I was on staff at that church for about 15 years and served as a pastor in a variety of roles. Left ministry in 2015. And have been doing media in one form or another for, about a decade since then.
Okay. Well, thanks for that overview. Is there a spiritual practice that you are finding particularly meaningful in your life right now?
You know, for me, it's the lectionary. Again, like I'm a Southern Baptist. I'm still a Southern Baptist, but just having the daily rhythm of reading widely in the scriptures has been very, very important, I think, to sort of grounding me in a larger story. So yeah, that's probably the central practice of my life, and then outside of that, you know, I try to do like an annual retreat where I do like a silence and solitude retreat. And I look forward to that a lot. I talk for a living, right? Like I'm a podcaster, so I talk for a living. So having, having something on the schedule where it's like, hey, for 3 or 4 days, you're not going to talk. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I really respect both of those answers. I mean, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, pretty much Anglican, and we live and breathe the lectionary. It's hard for me to imagine any other way, but that doesn't prevent me from feeling very blessed by it. And yeah, when, you're constantly creating content and having things to say, it's really nice to be able to just shut up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I make a lot of noise in my life, and it's nice to not have to make noise for a few days, for sure.
Yeah, I hear that. Okay, well, without further ado, let's get into the meat of our conversation. Now, we're primarily going to be talking about your new book, The Church in Dark Times, Understanding and Resisting the Evil That Seduced the Evangelical Movement. I've got my copy right here, and you can't quite tell from the video, but it's very dog-eared. I had a lot of notes as I was going through it. But I do want to take a bit of a step back before we get into the book, because many of our listeners, and myself included, have probably been very familiar with your work on the superb podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. That's how I came across your voice and your offering in the church. I would say that that podcast series really should be mandatory listening for anybody in church leadership. And your book really takes us into a deeper dive of some of the dynamics that you excavated in that podcast. So maybe for listeners who aren't familiar with it, or who just need to be refreshed on the background, can you just share with us what led you to the Mars Hill Project and what you were hoping to illuminate with it?
Yeah. So like I said, I was part of a church for about 15 years, serving on staff. We were connected to the Acts 29 movement. So we weren't planted by Acts 29, but we joined them. I guess we were part of the network from like 2004 or so to about 2010. And
Acts 29 is a church planting collective.
Right. Yeah. It's a church planting network that, essentially Mars Hill sat at the center of that network. And, so it gave me kind of a front row seat to Mars Hill and, the leadership issues there and sort of the broader, the broader milieu that it was a part of. My own church definitely went through its own season of sort of leadership turmoil and troubles. And so in trying to sort of understand and process what I had gone through, I kept coming back to the Mars Hill story, because I had seen, there were a variety of sort of parallels and similar issues there. And, so in I guess it was probably as early as 2019 that I first started talking to some former Mars Hill pastors about the possibility of doing a podcast to tell the story of the church and what had gone wrong. And, one thing led to another. And 2021, we launched the series.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that you do keep raising as a question, I think, through the podcast series, and then of course that you delve into more in the book, is like, why do we keep doing this? Like, it's a very particular story. And I think that the podcast is really effective because of how, particular you are about the landscape of Seattle and the specific characters that were very involved in the life of the community and the forming of that community. But at the same time, like, you're naming these dynamics that keep cropping up.
Yeah, for sure. And really, like, the Church in Dark Times is an extension of that inquiry, so to speak. I knew so many of these Mars Hill pastors. and in a way that was very similar to what I had seen at my own church. I was so aware of the fact that like, these were decent people. These were good people. That beyond decent, these were good people who would then find themselves on the side of a church discipline hearing where they, punished and humiliated and ostracized somebody who had really done nothing more than sort of, question a decision from Mark Driscoll. I had seen similar things. Right. And I was trying to understand, how does this kind of stuff happen? And, so I guess I'd say, one thing led to another, and, it led to me working on this book as a result.
Well, let's get into that specific dynamic. Because in your book, The Church in Dark Times, you really kind of drill into that specific dynamic, how it is that good people almost sort of knowingly do the wrong thing, right? That, that it's not that people didn't know that there were some toxic dynamics at work in the person who's at the helm of the community. It's not that there wasn't, I think in your analysis that in the example of Paul Petrie that you come back to a number of times in the book. So this is a person who was a leader in Mars Hill and raised what sounds like some pretty reasonable, just critical pushback to some governance stuff at the church, and got completely not just fired, but like excommunicated, a huge amount of like spiritual trauma done to him and his family as a result. And that, there's this sense of people knowing it's not necessarily the right thing to do, but that they feel like there's a greater objective, a more important objective that sort of makes it okay to do the wrong thing. And you talk about that as ideology. So can you just give us sort of the thesis of the book? What is it that you mean by ideology? How does ideological thinking lead to potentially disastrous decision making?
Yeah, certainly. When I talk about ideology, I always try to sort of distinguish, like, there's like lowercase I ideology, which is just sort of our worldviews, our systems of thought, the way we think the world operates. And then there's capital I ideology. And this is a very modern concept. And, I think it was Miroslav Volf who framed it this way. And, apologies to Dr. Volf if I get this wrong, but I think it was Miroslav Volf who said that ideology in that larger sense, like capital I ideology, is this little idea that's going to change the world. It's like if you have this one little concept, and the simpler the better, and if we implement it fully, it's going to change the world.
Right.
So in the political realm, it was, the ideology of communism was that the problem with the world was capitalists and the bourgeoisie. And if we could sort of eliminate them, then everything, socialist utopia was on the horizon.
Yeah.
For the Nazis, it was, Jews were the problem, right? What's fascinating is there's 1,000 iterations of this kind of ideology, this little idea that's going to change everything. And evangelicals, I think, have been seduced into adopting it, time and time again. Mars Hill's a great example of it. The ideology at Mars Hill was that the problem, Driscoll would say this constantly. 90% of the world's problems were because of young men. And so if you could reach young men with the gospel, then their conversions and them being sort of redirected, oriented to the church, etc., that would change everything. That would fix everything. You'd reach the city, you'd reach the world, you'd do the rest. What makes it an ideology is that it comes with this sort of ironclad circular logic where every criticism can then get sort of chewed up by that ideology, by that logic. And so, if the problem with the world is young men, and we're going to reach young men and we're going to build the whole church around it. If you show up and you criticize the church at any point, well, your problem is, you're a feminist, you're anti-man, you're not, you're not sufficiently evangelical in the ways that Driscoll would have announced. And the logic of that could sort of chew you up and spit you out as it went. And I think there's countless examples of this. I mean, there's something similar that goes on with Bill Hybels and sort of the kind of cult of leadership around Hybels as well. But, if you want to understand how does the church get to a place where good people are justifying evil activities, it often comes with, a core idea like this that they're rallied around and defending.
Now, is it fair to say that wrapped in that, again, kind of specific ideological idea for Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill, that generally in the church and in church leadership, there's a broader ideological principle, which is around growth, right? And that becomes part of what is ironclad as well. If the church is growing, if you're seen as reaching new people with the gospel, converting hearts, then how can you challenge the means to that end?
100%. I mean, the Great Commission is very compelling.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at the world in a way where it's all of life and all of ministry, it's all this cosmic battle between good and evil. And the stakes are that people are going to go to hell for an eternity. And just to be really clear, I don't deny, I don't deny the importance of the Great Commission or any of that. What happens though, that where it starts to kind of turn awry, is that churches and church leaders begin to think of their particular ministry and their particular work in a way that it's almost like you take God's providence out of the equation, and you say the burden is on us to figure out, how do we implement this Great Commission? How do we reach this city? How do we transform things? It's, there's I talk about this a bit in the book, there's a certain godlessness to the church growth movement, which says, here's a formula, and if you implement the formula effectively, you're going to reach, your whole city. You're going to transform the whole city. You're going to grow your church. It's as though we've sort of mechanized evangelism and the work of the gospel in a way where it's look, just obey the formula, and what comes out the other side of it is going to be, this radical transformation. Now, on the one hand, part of what's complicated about all of this is it kind of works, right? Mars Hill grew. They got to thousands and thousands of people. It worked for Bill Hybels. the question you have to start to ask when these things fall apart on the back end, and I hope that the church is doing some reflection on this, is, what exactly have you won people to? What is the gospel that you have won them with and transformed them? And, so I think there's a lot of sort of, I could rant for a while on this, but I think there's a lot of sort of downstream consequences to winning people to a kind of ideological vision of the church rather than the gospel itself.
Yeah. And, I appreciate the complexity that you always build into all of your work, because it isn't that God doesn't get in there too, right. There are lots of amazing stories of people's lives being sincerely met by the living God at Mars Hill and at, sort of any of these examples. But I think what you're calling us to is to be accountable for how we get there.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's kind. And it's extremely important to me. I mean, I think, one of the things that was interesting about them, just for a little behind the scenes of the Mars Hill thing, one of the things that was really, really important to me at the outset of that project was to tell the story in such a way that members of Mars Hill could see themselves in it. And what I mean by that is that, like, there's a way to tell the Mars Hill story where you create this kind of caricature, cartoonish version of the church and its members and Driscoll himself, where people from the outside can look in and go, why on earth would anybody have ever been a part of this thing? And I think it was really, really important to me to tell the story in such a way that Mars Hill members could say, yeah, that's why we were there. That's why it mattered to us. That's what was so significant about it. And, by God's grace, like that's how the thing unfolded. I mean, part of the comedy of the creation of that whole series was the fact that, we got, I think 5 episodes into it, and a number of people who had refused to talk to us for the series came around about 5 episodes in and said, okay, we're ready to talk. And we had to, like, throw the whole storyboard for the series out the window, and we were producing it in real time because we had new voices that we needed to include. Those people came around specifically because of the episode that we did on men and masculinity and what masculinity meant at Mars Hill. They heard that episode and they were like, okay, you understand why we were there. So we'll share our stories now. And, I mean, I'm proud of that. I'm proud that we were able to sort of tap into that and honor their experience by telling the story honestly, because it's very tempting to caricature the whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. And, as a listener, who is not familiar with that world at all, to be honest, and I do want to get into that a little bit more as well. Like I'm mainline through and through.
I'm sure it's a very strange world if you're mainline through and through.
But no, I really, I felt like I could locate myself in the story as well. I felt like one of the exciting things as a listener was that sense of the story expanding and deepening in real time as you're going along. Like it was quite a remarkable, multiplication of grace that sort of got lived out through the podcast. It was really interesting. I want to come back to your book though, because in your book you really get into a conversation with an interesting companion, Jewish social theorist Hannah Arendt. I I hope I'm pronouncing her name somewhat correctly. Her life's work was devoted to understanding how the Western world could have given birth to a culture that would be capable of murdering 11 million people in Nazism. What drew you to her work, and what do you think her insights offer us in Christian leadership?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I think you're doing a great job with the name. So well done. Yeah. Hannah Arendt, I mean, she's just a fascinating figure in the 20th century. And, so yes, she was a German Jewish social theorist. She ended up fleeing Germany in 1933. After the Nazi takeover, she was briefly imprisoned and questioned by the Gestapo for subversive activities. She ends up fleeing to France. She's there until essentially right before the German takeover of France. She's briefly imprisoned in a, what was essentially like a proto concentration camp in Gurs in France. The vast majority of the people who were imprisoned there ended up going to Auschwitz. They were actually eventually sent to Auschwitz. But she ends up, kind of in a similar way that she sort of talks her way out of the Gestapo. She's part of this conspiracy inside the camp in Gurs to create false documents to get out and escape to England and then eventually to the US. And she spends the rest of her life trying to understand how it was that the very people that she knew and loved, right? Like Arendt was this brilliant young intellectual in Germany in 1933. She was actually having an affair with Martin Heidegger at the time. She was trying to figure out how these people that she knew and loved could be transformed into collaborators, contributors, supporters of the Nazi project, including, as you mentioned, including the death camps themselves. And, what's so interesting about Arendt is that in 1950, she publishes a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, and reflecting on what took place, she essentially describes all of, the sort of ultimate result of the Nazi ideology and everything else as radical evil. It's this sort of unforeseen, incalculable evil that emerges in the world. And then, about a decade later, she goes to Israel to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Right. Eichmann was one of the primary architects of the final solution. And he had been kidnapped from Argentina and taken to Israel to stand trial. And she has this incredible revelation when she encounters Eichmann, because she can't get over the fact that Eichmann is just incredibly normal and kind of stupid. And that, his defense of himself is essentially this perpetual appeal to cliches and catchphrases and, very simplistic ideas. And it changes the way that she thinks about the whole history of Nazism and, the final solution, where she essentially says, this is where the people will be familiar with the phrase, the banality of evil.
The banality of evil, yeah.
Where this emerges for the first time, is she coins the phrase while talking about Eichmann, because she's like, this very normal, careerist, self-interested guy.
Administrator. Yeah.
Yeah. This bureaucrat became this monster. And how does that happen? And so when I was making The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, I remember the interview. I was having a conversation with somebody. We were talking about the Paul Petrie thing. And they basically said, yeah, it was like, for a decade we had been told church leadership is this one thing. This is the structure for it. This is how it should be done. And then all of a sudden we sort of turned on a dime because the mission was so important. We couldn't stick to this, arcane structure of our church polity. We had to vote on something new and different. And, Paul objected to that. And that was the first time I thought about Arendt because what happens in dictatorships always is there sort of comes a moment for the dictator where they say, hey, we have to suspend the normal rules, right? The normal rules of democracy and, the way we're governed, we need to suspend all of that because there's this crisis, whatever the crisis might be. The crisis is so urgent, we have to deal with that. Mm-hmm. And in the church, we do that with the mission. We do that with evangelism. We do that with, again, this cosmic battle that we're a part of, trying to win people's souls before they go to hell. And again, I'm still an evangelical. I still think those convictions are real. But this idea that we suspend the rules for the sake of the mission, for the sake of the growth of the church, is extraordinarily dangerous. And I think time and again, you've seen examples where that's happened, and you've seen what the results are. And Mars Hill is the pinnacle example of it. So I think the parallels between kind of the cult of personality that takes place around a leader like Mark Driscoll and the cult of personality that takes place around dictatorship are very clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to what you said a little bit earlier about, wanting to make sure that your portrayal of Mars Hill was not a caricature, that the people of Mars Hill could see themselves in the podcast. But yeah. I think the corollary of that is that listeners who aren't part of the Mars Hill story don't walk away thinking, well, that's about other people who aren't like me and I would never do that. And, it's kind of an interesting spectacle, but there's no takeaway, right? And to me, that is, I think, an important insight in the banality of evil as well, is that, we shouldn't hear the story of Nazi Germany without doing some interior work in our own souls and our own capacity to participate in things that are absolutely horrific, right? So, sorry,
no, if I can just jump in, I would just say, I think it's so critical. I think it's so critical for people who heard that series to resist the temptation to say, wow, those people are crazy.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, if you had been there, if you had been in those pews, if you had been in those community groups, if you had been part of the scene in which that church emerged, the predominant likelihood is that you would have been drawn into it, totally compelled by it, devoted your life to it, and been burned horrifically, as so many of those people were in the aftermath. So,
and the other component that I kept coming back to in listening to it, I'm a church leader, and as I said before, I am mainline through and through. There's a lot about the evangelical church culture that is quite foreign to me. And certainly I wouldn't see myself as having a ton in common with a Mark Driscoll. And I really the levels of celebrity and the platforms and, kind of the reach of a Mark Driscoll is in a different universe from anything that most of my colleagues or that I experience. And yet at the same time, like I felt like I needed to do some soul searching with regards to his story, because like our churches might be smaller, but they can also be very personality driven. And mainline leaders can also very much succumb to Messiah complexes and to feeling, that as you said earlier, that kind of like godless agenda of like, it's all up to me. It's all up to me to save this thing. I think any of us in church leadership should be able to relate to that weight of expectation that gets placed on us when we're at the front of the church. So like, what's kind of a different model from that, like, cult of personality? Because I think it can trip us all up.
No, I appreciate the way you're framing this, because I think it's so key that Christian leaders keep in mind that, this is not unique to mega churches. This is something that is it's a temptation for all of us. One of my favorite podcasts of all time is an episode of This American Life that I think it's called Petty Tyrant is the name of the episode, or Petty Tyrants. And
I'm just
in this episode,
down.
They tell the story of a guy who was essentially he was like the superintendent of maintenance for a school system. And you hear that and you think, how could that guy be like a petty tyrant? But they tell this story of the way this guy just like had a stranglehold over the entire school district, and everybody was subservient to him. And he ran his team with this sort of mob-like sense of loyalty and discipline and militancy and all the rest. And it's a wild story. I mean, it's a crazy story. But for me, as somebody who had been inside of an unhealthy church with a leader who had an unhealthy, grasp of his importance and the role of leadership and all the rest, it was just also totally believable and familiar. And I love referencing it because I think it reminds us of, the church's problems are they're ultimately like just deeply human problems. We have a problem with power. Power is an incredible temptation. And it also reminds us of the fact that, like, I think the reason a Mars Hill can happen is because people are lonely and isolated and they're looking for purpose and meaning. And someone like Mark Driscoll comes up with an extraordinary amount of charisma and conviction and says, give your life away to this and you'll be happy on the other side of it. And it's the same way that, populist movements of all stripes kind of end up working. Dave Foster Wallace said, we're all dying to give ourselves away to something. And smart leaders have a way of tapping into that desire and saying, like, here's your purpose. Here's your meaning. Here's what you're supposed to give yourself away to. I'm sorry. I feel like I've lost your original question, but I think that's certainly what the book is about, is how does that happen? And really sort of tracing it back into even just the history of modernity and trying to understand, like, why are we rootless? Why are we lonely and isolated? Why are we so vulnerable to people who show up and say, I have a wonderful plan for your life?
Yeah, yeah. And I really appreciate how thoroughly you explore all of those different dynamics. There's a thread that I'm really interested on pulling on with you. I interviewed last year Michael Graham, who was one of the authors of The Great Dechurching. And I think that the research in that book highlights a reality that we're all facing across the evangelical and mainline world, which is decline right across the board in people interested in institutional religion. And this feeling that like something that we love and care about is disappearing in front of our eyes. To what degree do you feel like that background of secularism, of anxiety for the church's survival plays into, I think, both the hero worship of a Mark Driscoll who comes along and seems to have the answers and then the success to back it up, but also then feeling threatened by critical voices that might try to, break that facade in any way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the rise of secularism plays a huge role in all of this. Something I talk about in the book is the philosopher Charles Taylor. He has this concept that he refers to as bundled identity. So like if you're born 500 years ago, you're Bavarian, you're a baker's son, you're betrothed to the butcher's daughter, you're Catholic, you can kind of go down the line of all these identity markers. And
you know where you'll live your whole life.
Exactly. None of those things are questions, right?
Yeah.
Not only are they not questions, like the thought of questioning those identity markers is never going to cross your mind just because of the structures of society and the, what he refers to as the social imaginary. Like that's all just kind of baked in and locked in. And what modernity does is it unbundles all of that. And so unlike this guy born 500 years ago, when we come of age, we have to figure out, well, what am I doing with my life? Where am I going to live? Who do I love? Yeah. Do I love men or women? You can just kind of go down the line of all of these questions. And on the one hand, you can look at, all of that and the Industrial Revolution and all of these things and say, hey, there's a lot of positives, right? Like
a lot of positives. Yeah.
The guy, as Owen Wilson says in Midnight in Paris, like these people don't have antibiotics, right? Looking back in the past, we love modernity. I love air conditioning. I love antibiotics. Like there's a lot of positives, but the negatives are that all of that unbundling, it doesn't just give us questions. It gives us anxiety. Because even when you answer the questions, I'm going to live here, I'm going to do this, I'm going to marry this person, I'm going to do, whatever, you're left going, well, did I make the right decision? Did I marry the right person? Did I choose the right religion? Did I move to the right city? Did I take the right job? And that anxiety creates all kinds of problems for us. And with it comes this loosening of connections to institutions that are meaning making, whether that's the state or the church or the family or whatever else. Our bonds with those meaning making institutions have grown weaker and weaker. So when a charismatic person comes along and says, I've got a story for you, I've got meaning for you, I've got purpose for you, I've got a direction for your life, it's profoundly compelling. And once somebody locks in on that, I mean, this was something that the Mars Hill guys would talk about all the time. Like they would say, you know, I remember one guy saying, I resonate with, he said, I remember talking to a Vietnam vet, and that guy saying, of course I don't miss the war because I don't miss having bullets fly by my head, but I do miss waking up in the morning having a purpose.
Yeah.
And these Mars Hill folks kind of feeling the same way. Like, they don't miss Mark. They don't miss the manipulation. They recognize it for what it is now. But that sense of purpose and meaning, the way it bonded them with one another, they miss all of that. And I get that. And I think that's a phenomenon of modernity for sure.
Yeah. I just want to open up your book here because there's this one little part that I just keep coming back to. The book of Revelation tells a much larger story in which ambiguity about the church at Ephesus's future is ultimately overshadowed by the defeat of the devil and the victory of the kingdom of God. It's a clear, sobering message that our communities may not last forever and that redemption doesn't depend on them. An honest church mission statement based on these warnings would be, so-and-so community church, here in fear and trembling until God removes our lampstand. I think that contrast between kind of the biblical reality of just how fragile our human efforts really are and how dependent upon the grace of God they actually need to be. You can see why that's not the mission statement that most of us go for. That like having that much more, do this and you'll be successful and you'll know what your life is about and we'll have the numbers to show for it. Like, of course that's such a compelling antidote to all of that modern angst that you talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, and they said, they said if you could offer one prescription for pastors who are trying to figure out how do I not get sucked into the grandiosity, of ideology and all the rest, what would it be? And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, well, this is very on brand for me in terms of its sort of crushing morosity. But my headphones unplugged. My prescription would be to remember your death. I mean, I feel like so much of what happens around celebrity pastors and the whole sort of church growth phenomenon and all of this, it's like it's Tower of Babel stuff. It's let's make our name great, and at the end of the day, like, one reason I think the Mars Hill story is so darn important is because by 2013, when you removed Mark from the church collapsed. Mm-hmm. That's horrendous. Mm-hmm. That's a nightmare. That's disaster. That's failure on every level. And that should be the most damning aspect of that story for anybody who's trying to sort of assess what happened there in Driscoll, is that the church couldn't outlive the guy. That's that's horrific. And so if we're not building our ministries in such a way that, I mean, I think it was the Moravian missionaries had the phrase, preach the gospel, die and be forgotten. If that's not in our minds, that we can be forgotten, and that ministry can sort of move beyond us or move on after us. It has to.
It has to.
Then we've truly gotten this whole thing backwards. And unfortunately, I think the reality of where the church is in North America and in the West in general, there are a lot of churches that are really built on the backs of personalities, and death is going to be a cold awakening for all of them. And bad news, like, you're not going to escape it,
Yeah.
And it's like, and that's where it's like the tradition is such a gift to us if we actually paid attention to it, because Ash Wednesday every year ought to be reminding pastors of, like, dude, don't make this thing about yourself.
Yeah. You're dust, man.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to return to the dust. All of us go down to the dust.
I say dude, but I use the universal non-gendered dude, men and women.
The non-gendered dude.
It applies to all.
It certainly does. Yeah. So remember your death. Celebrate Ash Wednesday. What are some other acts of resistance? Because, like we've identified very clearly, I think we're all susceptible to these cults of personality. I think we're all susceptible to the arrogance of thinking that it is about us. And I think that we'd all like lots more certainty and people showing us the road of success. So the last part of your book does get into practices of resistance. Do you want to name any others to that list?
Yeah, no, I talk about a number in there. The book ends on, with an emphasis in particular on the practices of worship, and I try to sort of delineate worship as something broader than, the sort of revivalistic experiences, like trying to look at worship as something that is really about orienting yourself around a particular story. And I think that's the key thing in all of this. In the modern era, people who are lonely and purposeless and searching get drawn into, whether it's a populist political movement or a sort of church growth phenomenon or a cult or whatever. They get drawn into those things because of all of the, all of these sort of historical things we've been talking about here. The church's cure for that is not to provide like a counter narrative in the sense of, well, here's a populist. I mean, Mars Hill was a populist movement in a lot of ways. And that was no solution, because that thing's going to fall apart the minute that Mark leaves.
Yeah.
What the church has to offer is something that's this bigger story, this larger narrative to find meaning and purpose inside of. And I think worship and liturgy are a key way of doing that. I think creating culture and storytelling are a really key way to do that as well. I mean, one of the reasons I think, for me personally, one of the reasons doing the Mars Hill podcast was so important was, I felt like it was a way to shine a light on the futility and toxicity of these phenomenon, and maybe to get some Christians to think about their faith in a bigger and broader way, to point to a better and more beautiful church that is possible outside of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, just kind of following up on that for a moment, like how has your work been received in the evangelical world? Like, does what you have put together, does it feel threatening to some people? Like, has it, what's the reaction?
Yeah. A great question. What's encouraging is that I would say that by and large, the vast majority of the reaction has been a recognition of the truth to the story, and a recognition of the reality of the issues and the challenges. And so I'm very encouraged in terms of the way people have responded to it and all of that.
I'm glad to hear that. That's really good.
Yeah, no, I was, I wasn't surprised by that. I kind of expected that people would hear the thing and go, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Plus I think the nature of kind of how we told the story, because we focus so much on kind of telling it from the inside, focusing on leaders who were actually really a part of the movement. It makes it, I guess, it makes it hard to argue with.
Well, and it wasn't an expose, like it was a number of years after the whole thing collapsed. So it's not like you were trying to bring it down in the midst of its like,
we weren't breaking news with it. We weren't telling people things that for the most part, we weren't telling people things that weren't already kind of a matter of the public record. I mean, I think in the last 3 episodes, we did have some things in those episodes that had not been published or talked about before, but for the most part, it was all pretty much out there. So it was really about challenging people to just sort of reckon with the reality of it. That said, there were a handful of folks who, were very unhappy with what we did. I'll never forget. So in the midst of this, I got invited to go speak at a, or to do, like a Q&A, like an onstage Q&A at a conference, for some very, very, very large churches. And I'd actually been invited by the pastor of, I won't name drop any of these folks, but like, I was invited by the pastor of a very, very large church, one of the largest churches in North America, asked me to come and do this Q&A with him at this event. And, I get there and, I'm looking at the schedule, and, this is a fault of mine, but like for events like this, I often don't pay a lot of attention to what is on the schedule. I just sort of like, I know I'm speaking, I'm going to do my thing, I'm going to show up and do it, and then I'm going to go home. And, so I didn't really pay a lot of attention to what else was on the schedule. And I get there and I'm looking at the schedule, and I see that our Q&A is right before the main speaker for that evening. And it just so happened that the main speaker for that evening was another big time megachurch guy, who the weekend before, in his sermon to his church of, 40, 50,000 people, had denounced me from the stage. And so I'm looking at the schedule going, oh wow, like I'm the opening act for this guy. And, so in the green room before the session, he comes in, and, when he realizes who I am, he says, he makes some snide comment about, I hope you don't make a podcast about the dumb things I said in my 30s. And, I said, oh, well, were you in the habit of saying these kinds of things? And I, threw some Driscoll quotes at him, just to be clear. But the hostility was real, and it was thick. And then I just felt this incredible irony, because I did this Q&A. I did this Q&A, and the last thing that they asked me was, if you had one piece of advice to give pastors, who don't want to become the next Mark Driscoll, like, what would you tell them? And I told them that Moravian missionary quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, preach the gospel, die and be forgotten. And I said, I think pastors need to remember their death, and they need to embrace a posture that says, preach the gospel, die and be forgotten. And I walked off stage laughing at the irony that, people reacted very positively to that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I walked off stage laughing at the irony that right after they had reacted so positively to that, the introduction began for this celebrity pastor guy with, I don't know how many campuses and video streaming and, this, that, and the other, whose entire empire is really built around his personality.
Yeah.
And if he gets hit by a bus tomorrow, they're in big trouble. So he was not a fan.
Okay.
That's a long answer to your question. There've been a few encounters like that have been fascinating to me, and honestly have ultimately just sort of led me to a deeper and deeper conviction that what we did was the right thing and it mattered.
Yeah. I would be really surprised if a few buttons didn't get pushed because of the level of truth telling, and it should ruffle a few feathers, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to wrap up with one more question before we take a break and go to our closing questions. On your podcast, you always concluded your description of the project with the note that, along with excavating the growth and collapse of this church, this is also a podcast about God showing up in broken places and the mystery of God showing up in broken places. Yeah. So can you just say a word about where you see God showing up right now in all of the ways that the church can get things so horribly wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sorry. I'm trying to think about how to formulate this answer. One of the funny ironies in my life, post Mars Hill, is that I have a bunch of family members who, around the time I was making the show, showed up on the doorstep of a sort of infamous celebrity pastor. Let's put it that way. The kind of celebrity pastor where when you see the name, there's been plenty of scandal around this person.
Okay.
And they just wandered in the doors of that church, on an Easter Sunday because they were looking for a church, and it was the big church in town and kind of where things were happening. And they all had a radical and beautiful conversion experience. They got baptized that day. And it's been quite a few years, and they're still there and they're still connected. So I love that fact. Yeah. I love that they're there. I love that happened. I love that they've encountered grace, and that the message of the gospel has cut through to their hearts in an environment like that. Because I would have, I could talk to you for an hour about the reasons why I'm concerned about that guy and what he's about and what his community is kind of about. But the gospel breaks through.
Yeah.
And I'll say this too. One of the great ironies about, the rise and fall of Mars Hill, lots of people listen to that show and make assumptions that the voices they're hearing have all deconstructed and abandoned the faith, and, they're all bitter and angry and they hate God and all the rest now. And, with maybe one or two exceptions, that's not true of any of those folks. Almost every single person that you heard on the rise and fall of Mars Hill is still going to church. They're still tied into a community. They're still people of faith. They still believe that Jesus died and rose again on the third day. And yeah, they're rough around the edges, but you know what? They were rough around the edges before Mars Hill collapsed.
Yeah.
That's kind of that's part of what made Mars Hill such a remarkable and interesting and beautiful place. So, I just see constant evidence of God showing up in the midst of it. And it's, I think what I wrestle with, I do genuinely wrestle with what's the duty of someone that's a journalist like me. What's our duty for, how do I put this even? What's our duty to truth telling versus what's our duty to sort of honoring, the experience of victims in these different places versus what's our duty to hold out the gospel as a hope that shines above and beyond all of it. But that said, I'm just always happily surprised by the way the gospel seems to continue to break through.
Yeah. I think that, there's a lot of, you could feel a lot of cynicism about these patterns and, about the ever thus sort of nature of these stories, of how wrong we get it as Christians and as church communities. But you can also walk away with just a profound sense of the ultimate truth of God's power, even, well, in response to that sinfulness, in response to how wrong we get it. So
for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take a break and we'll come back for a couple of closing questions as we wrap up our conversation today. Welcome back to Future Christian. I am going to wrap up my conversation with Mike Cosper with a couple of rapid fire closing questions. So these are questions that we ask all of our guests on Future Christian, and you have the choice about how seriously you want to take these questions. You can take them with a grain of salt, or you can take them very seriously. It's up to you. So, Mike, if you were made Pope for a day, what would be on your agenda for that day?
Goodness, Pope for the day. Pope for the day is so specific, right? Because I'm not like the emperor, and I don't have a magic wand, but I can adjust doctrine. The funny thing is, and this surprises people sometimes, because some people think that the rise and fall of Mars Hill was like an unsubtle attack on Reformed theology. But I'm actually very Reformed. In fact, I'm probably more Reformed in terms of my convictions than I was before I made the show. Not having anything to do with the show. So all of that to say, if I'm Pope for the day. I'm probably doing something with the 95 Theses that undoes a lot of Catholic doctrine very quickly.
All right, you're going to have fun on that day.
Yeah.
Who is a theologian or historical Christian figure who you would want to meet or bring back to life, have supper with?
Yeah, this one's easy. Thomas Merton.
Oh, good.
So I live in Louisville, Kentucky. About an hour and 10 minutes down the road from us is the Abbey of Gethsemane, which is where Merton lived out his monastic life.
Mm-hmm.
I think Merton was so dialed in. I mean, the irony of me saying this about Merton right after saying I'm super reformed. Now I'm going to advocate for a Cistercian monk. I think Merton was so dialed in to the challenges of modernity and what that meant for the soul, what it meant for identity. I also think Merton was somebody who was just he so understood and he was the best articulator of modern angst of trying to understand, like, how do I live the Christian life in this world where identity is contested in all of these weird and bizarre ways. And, just his humanity, his generosity, his interest in other people. I just adore the guy, and, I love his writing, and that's very easy for me. I'd walk a mile on broken glass to have dinner with, Thomas Merton.
Okay. I love that answer. And I do love the contrast to the first answer. I think that's great.
Right. Yeah. My first answer is Martin Luther, and my second answer is Cistercian monks. So,
I feel like there's room for all of it, and they'd probably enjoy chatting with each other too. So,
oh yeah. Put those two together at a dinner table. That'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think so. What will history remember from our current time and place?
Gosh, that's a great question. It's a hard question. So I think we're living in this moment of populism on both the right and the left, especially in the US. That is, I guess I'd say, like, the outcome of it is uncertain. So hopefully not that, because if we're remembered for the populist moment, it means something went even worse from where it is right now. So that's my fear. I would say with that fear is my fear about, and this is where, like, my journalist hat comes on. Likewise, I hope this moment isn't remembered for what's happening in Eastern Europe right now.
Right.
Because I think that if the war in Ukraine goes badly, if Ukraine
more
does
badly.
not win, right. Yeah, exactly. If Ukraine doesn't win, we're looking at a much more significant conflict in a year or two down the line from here. So hopefully neither of those things. Positively, I don't know. I'm not a big Elon Musk fan, but what SpaceX is doing right now is kind of awesome.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Hopefully we'll remember this era for, like, we'll forget Elon being weird on Twitter, and we'll remember him for, efficient electric cars and, renewable rocket, technology. Because, man, I don't know if you saw the video of SpaceX landing their own booster rocket back on the launcher, the other day.
No, I did not see that.
Utterly incredible. amazing. And economy transforming, frankly. Hopefully we remember that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, in fact, actually, given the question, sorry, I'm ranting now, but Elon's kind of the perfect example. It's like, hopefully the past looks back and they remember Elon Musk for SpaceX and Tesla. They don't remember Elon Musk for, his investment in right-wing populism.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a very balanced answer as well. And time will tell.
We will. Yeah,
it sure will. We'll know more in the future. Yeah. Where can people find more about you? Where can they connect with your work?
Yeah. So, I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter more than I should be. My wife is constantly encouraging me to get off Twitter. So,
okay.
But I'm on Twitter at Mike Cosper and, reachable there. And then I work for Christianity Today and produce podcasts there. I'm the co-host of a show called The Bulletin, which is a weekly news and issues show. It's also a show that we do. It's also a show where we do, like weekly deep dive one-on-one interviews on specific topics as well. So subscribe to The Bulletin wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find me there. And, I write and contribute at CT on a fairly regular basis as well.
And make sure to pick up your copy of the book, The Church in Dark Times, Understanding and Resisting the Evil That Seduced the Evangelical Movement. I highly recommend it. I assume that people can get that wherever they get their books.
Wherever fine books are sold, for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your insights and all of the journalistic research that has gone into years of work, really, with the book and the podcast and your writing. It's a really important offering to the life of the church. We always conclude with a word of peace. So, Mike, may God's peace be with you.
Thank you. Also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.